first try. Normally it takes me like 10 tries to get a decent click out, but that was perfect. Little do you know, this is my 4th time trying to record this introduction. About a month ago now, I released a video talking about roticity in the context of Australian accents. And I explained what roticity means in that video. Basically, it's the difference between pronouncing the letter R at the end of a word or before a consonant or whatever, and not doing it. So Australians, we don't do it. We are non-rhotic, so we say car and cart, whereas Americans are rhotic, they do it, and they say car and cart. And there's a reason that I used Americans as the example of rhotic people, even though rhoticity is shown off by a lot more than just Americans. There's also Canadians, there's Scottish people, there's Irish people, there's even people from the West Country in Lancashire. A lot of people have rhotic accents, but when Australians think about rhoticity, they tend to think about Americans. And there's a bit at the end of this video that I made where I talk about how by a lot, I mean a tiny amount who just seem like a lot because they stand out so much. A few young people in Australia who are more on the chronically online end of us are starting to gain rhoticity because of American influence. And in that case, it is specifically American, because Americans have a lot of influence culturally over Australia, especially on the internet. So people in Australia who spend so much time on the internet, they might end up hearing American accents pretty much their entire waking life. And so, of course, their accents are going to get more American as a consequence. A lot of people saw that part of the video and went down into the comments and started being they started going all doomer on me, of being like, no, the Australian accent's going to be lost. We're going to be replaced with American accents. And this is part of a broader issue that comes up in Australian culture and the media of how much influence we're getting from the United States. Because the majority of the music we listen to, the TV shows we watch, the movies we watch, all sorts of stuff, it comes from America. Even on social media, the majority of activity on English-speaking social media comes from the United States. And so Australia gets a lot of influence from the United States, just like everywhere else in the English-speaking world, and a lot of us get anxious about that. There's this sort of pervasive anxiety that's spread through a lot of Australia over the last few decades of, we're getting so much American influence that we're going to be replaced culturally and linguistically by Americans. This is an issue that gets blown out of proportion very easily. It's something that the media will catch on to because they'll be like, ooh, here's something to scare people about. Quick, report on it. And so I thought I'd make a video trying to clear it up a little bit. How much influence do Americans actually have over how Australians talk? And this will, of course, be different for old people versus young people, because young people get more American influence than old people. But I'll go over all that, and I'm going to go through 3 areas of linguistic influence. I'm going to go through our vocabulary and then our accents. And I think that's what a lot of people are most concerned about. Because you do find in Australia, especially among really little kids, people who just have American accents, and they've never been to America in their life. My girlfriend used to be one of these kids where they just get so much American media that their accents become American, or they don't necessarily become American, but they gain a few specific cues that Australians lock onto as being American, like rhoticity. So first of all, there's something that a lot of Australians probably notice and get pissed off by, and that is the amount of American vocabulary that Australians nowadays use. So, back in the old days, Australians used to have all this unique Australian slang. Words like bloke or mate or cobber or Sheila. All these, characteristic Australian words that we've embraced as part of our national identity. Young people are using them less and less over time, and they're starting to use American alternatives more. Some of the examples I just gave, bloke is being gradually replaced by words like guy and dude, which are more associated with Americans. The word mate to mean friend is still widespread among a lot of young people's speech, but some young people are starting to switch to buddy or pal. The word that most people complain about is y'all. And y'all is a really interesting word to look at. Basically, ever since we stopped using thou as a pronoun in everyday speech, we've kind of had a gap in our pronoun system. Singular and plural tend to have different pronouns. In first person, it's I in singular and we in plural. But in the second person, it's fuzzy because we've lost that distinction. Now we use you to refer to both singular and plural. If I say you, you've got to rely on context to figure out if I'm talking about singular or plural. So there's this gap in our pronouns, right? And in English dialects all around the world, that's been filled in using a variety of techniques. People have invented new pronouns to sort of fill in this gap that we've got. And in Australia, traditionally, that gap has been filled with yous. So you to refer to one person and yous to refer to multiple people. But in recent decades, it has been slowly and gradually sort of encroached upon by the American version of that pronoun, which is y'all. Now, y'all originated in the American South. It got very popular in the American South and also in African-American vernacular English, which sort of developed alongside white Southern United States English. And so it also got the word y'all, and then nowadays with social media and everything, through a very fascinating, linguistically and socially and culturally fascinating turn of events, African-American vernacular English ends up with a huge amount of cultural prestige, Black American words end up being massively popular on TikTok, and then they end up spreading to all of the youths around the world, and it ends up being that African American vernacular English spreads its words all across the world to people who may have never even been to America. And one of these words is y'all. That went onto the internet and became popular amongst people who use the internet a lot. Social media and its associated linguistics has more of an influence over young people, and young people end up through this squiggly chain of events using a lot of terms of phrase and, ways of speaking that are characteristically more similar to African American English, which is in and of itself a really fascinating topic. But I digress. Young Australians are starting to use y'all due to its social media and internet prestige, and it's replacing the traditional Australian and Irish and Scottish yous. Even though throughout the entire history of Australia, saying yous to refer to multiple people has kind of been seen as a bad thing. Like if you say that, you're uneducated or you're dumb or you speak a dialect, you use slang. Now, through most of the history of English, the past participle of the word get has just been got. I have got sick. I have got accustomed to it. But in America, a long time ago, they innovated a new form of this past tense, which was gotten. And nowadays, a lot of people, not just in Australia, but also in the UK as well, are using gotten as the past participle of get, even though it's not a traditional feature of that dialect. Due to subtle American influence, gotten is starting to replace that use of the word got all throughout the English-speaking world. And the reason that this happens is simultaneously because of all of the influence Americans have, but also for convenience, It's the same kind of thing with y'all. Y'all comes in and fills in a gap in the grammar of English, same thing with gotten. If it weren't for the form gotten, then the word get, its past simple and past participle forms would be identical, which kind of leaves a grammatical hole, and people don't tend to like those, and so it gets filled in with whatever's there. And whatever's there, in both cases, happens to be American. Even though for the first one there is an Australian alternative, that's kind of gotten less popular with social media, yada yada, I already talked about this. And now let's talk about phonology. This is what my last video was about the phonology of the Australian accent over time. And a lot of people, there's a lot of people saying, oh, we're all sounding more American as time goes on. And there are a few ways in which this is definitely true. For instance, the word button, or another word that follows the same pattern, mutton. In traditional, older, broader Australian dialects of English, this would have been pronounced as button or mutton. But nowadays, most Australians pronounce it as button and mutton. There's a very subtle difference in there between button and button. Why did that change happen? It sounds so arbitrary and simple. Well, it's because button and mutton is the American pronunciations of those words. So we used to say the more Australian mutton and button, but now it's getting more and more common to say mutton and button like Americans do. And there's also a thing with yod dropping. Now, yod dropping and yod coalescence and everything is a very interesting topic, which it will require a whole explanation that I can't really get into for time right now. But basically, imagine the word new said by an Australian and then an American. An American would say new. They would drop the y sound at the start of the vowel, whereas Australians and British people keep it. That is, with the exception of some younger Australians. I've noticed this is quite a pervasive feature, but still not universal, still in the minority. a lot of young Australians are beginning to drop that y sound in words like new, June, tune. A lot of Australians are dropping that y sound now, just like Americans, and that's probably because, the most likely explanation is because of American influence. Another thing that I think is definitely getting more American over time is something called incidence. I've looked on the internet, and of course I'm not a trained linguist. I don't know the exact proper term, but I've seen phonemic incidence and lexical incidence used kind of interchangeably for this phenomenon. And it's basically when different words have different pronunciations in different dialects that are not tied to the accent itself. So one that a lot of people pointed out in my last video is that I pronounce I pronounce process interchangeably as process and process. I think process is the English one and process is the American one. Now, this is a very common thing that gets brought up with American accents and everyone else of things like incidents in this. So Americans saying process instead of process or ass instead of arse. And in quite a few of these words, especially those two that I just mentioned, Australians are starting to adopt the American version of that word as opposed to the traditional, more British version that Australia has traditionally held. But then we start to get fuzzy with American influence. Let's go over all those categories again and really look at how much influence America actually has in them. So with vocabulary, it's clear to see that a lot of traditional Australian slang is being replaced by American slang. But I wouldn't say that this is purely because of American influence. Slang naturally changes over time, and over time, certain slang words that have been in use for a long time fall out of fashion. They become old-fashioned naturally. That's just a thing that happens with slang over time. And you could see this transition from, bloke to guy as a thing of American influence. Or you could see it as young Australians abandoning the old-fashioned slang bloke in favour of the newer slang, which just so happens to be from America. And the reason I don't think Australian slang is, in danger of being replaced by American slang is because we're still coming up with new slang. There's a lot of pretty new slang in Australian English. For example, esche. I don't know when esche originated, but I don't think it's a very old word. I think it's a pretty new word that's kind of spread around Australia through social media. That is a uniquely Australian slang word, and it's one of many examples that Australia is still developing new slang. We're not just completely being, overwhelmed by American slang, we're still making up our own stuff. It's just that certain words that are getting old-fashioned are being replaced by their American alternatives because they're getting old-fashioned. Of course, there is still American influence like I outlined before, but it's not all-encompassing, it's not existentially threatening, it's just one aspect of our modern English. Just now while I was editing, I thought of one last point that I want to make about the fact that a lot of our vocabulary is being replaced with American equivalents. And that is the fact that a lot of these words that are getting replaced with their American counterparts aren't completely Australian in the first place. Like, it's easy as Australians to forget that people in the UK also say mate basically every day among certain social groups. Like, it's also very common over there. A lot of our words and a lot of our pronunciations aren't necessarily Australian. They are also English, maybe Welsh, maybe Irish, maybe Scottish. A lot of the vocabulary and pronunciations that are disappearing from Australian English and getting replaced with American counterparts aren't even completely Australian in the first place. Like, sure, the English process might be getting replaced by the American process, but what does that even matter in the first place for Australians when process to begin with was still British? For a lot of these things, I don't necessarily see it as Australian English being replaced with American English, so much as I see it as us swapping out the British for the American. As Simon Roper would say, apologies for my drowned rat appearance. So the main point of this video, the main reason I made this was because of people's reactions to young Australians starting to gain roticity. Only in small amounts, only amongst certain demographics and certain types of people. Now, I talk about this a lot in my last video, but there is often in language, when languages change, especially when phonology changes, not always, but often, there is a social motivator behind it. There is a social reason people will want to change their accents. This kind of thing, where accents change because of connotations with social prestige and the opposite, are found all over history, all over the world, all throughout English. This is particularly the case with features that are marked. I talk about this in my last video as well, but features that people notice are more likely to have connotations. If you don't notice a feature, obviously you're not going to think about it too hard, but if you notice a feature, you are much more likely to associate things like education level or age or anything with it. And so we can use this pattern that sound changes that carry prestige will increase and get more popular, and then sound changes that people don't like will get less popular. We can use that pattern to sort of tentatively predict where accents might go in the future, how they might change, based off of the connotations that features have today. So if in Australia roticity was going to get more popular and become more and more common, it would probably have to hold some kind of prestige. Now let's look at roticity in Australia. We notice it, we definitely notice it. And so we can use that model that we've just observed of how if a feature is noticeable, its amount of social prestige can kind of dictate where it goes in the future. So let's look amongst young people, how much social prestige does roticity have? And on top of that, there's another layer to it. How much social prestige do the people who talk rotically have themselves? And it's pretty easy to tell who they are, the two types of people who have the most chance of being rotic in Australia. They are very young children who watch a lot of American TV or cartoons or YouTube, and nerds who are all over the internet and spend a lot of time on the internet and hear a lot of Americans talk in their day-to-day life. Nerds and young children are perhaps among the lowest possible social prestige groups that you could find. Alright, so that's the people dealt with. What about the roticity itself? Roticity is very noticeable, and it's also very American sounding to our Australian ears. Even though, of course, not only Americans do it, we primarily associate it with Americans. And so we hear roticity, we think American. We think back to that sort of cultural anxiety we have of Americans replacing us. And most of us kind of get uneasy or annoyed or whatever when we hear rhotic accents. Now, if you are an Australian who talks with a rhotic accent, this isn't me dunking on you. I don't hold these associations. This is just what most people probably feel subconsciously on a very low subconscious level. When Australians hear rhoticity, they notice it and they think that person sounds American or that person sounds annoying. Both of those are kind of the same thing here. So let's look at what we've got here. Throughout history, throughout time, throughout space, we've noticed time and time again that noticeable features tend to become more popular if they are perceived positively and less popular if they are perceived negatively. In Australia, we notice roticity, so that's checked off, and most of us perceive it negatively. On top of that, the people who do it are typically not necessarily perceived negatively, but don't have a high amount of social influence or prestige. And so it's pretty easy to say that roticity, if it does not decrease in Australia, it's probably not going to get much higher. I don't think there's any point within the foreseeable future where Australian accents are going to become rhotic due to American influence, because Australians have a lot of reservations about American influence. We don't like it. If corporations have to worry about getting into the Australian market because of the Australian aversion to American influence, how on earth can we expect Australians to change their own accents to sound more American when, to most people, it's actively frowned upon? So there you go. I don't reckon that Australian accents are going to get significantly more American. There's definitely American influence on Australian English, and it's definitely becoming more and more as time goes on and as we get more and more into social media and American media. But I don't think there's ever going to be a point where Australians start to sound American. And one last thing is that whatever trajectory we're on at the moment and whatever, phase Australian English is in right now, it's not forever. It seems pretty much inevitable that over time the different dialects of English around the world right now are going to diverge into different languages, just like the different dialects of Vulgar Latin evolved into French, Italian, Romanian, all of those languages. And so even if right now everyone seems afraid that Australian English is going to be replaced with American English or that it's going to get more American, in the long run, it's pretty much inevitable that we're going to end up with a uniquely Australian dialect and a uniquely Australian language just far enough in the future. I guess what I mean to say is just don't stress. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't watched that roticity video, check it out. It is the best video I've made thus far. Everyone, please put your hands together for my two longest supporting supporters, Kira and Velocihog, then Nuticus, then Conacor, then Milan Kundere. I don't know which language that's from. I'm sorry, I don't know which phonology to use to pronounce that. Bailey Field. Bailey Field has a very nice profile picture. I think it's of like some kind of honey flower. And Danielle B, who joined, I think today by the looks of that. That's crazy. Thank you, Danielle B. Now in the week, holy shit, shut up. Okay, now in the week or so since I recorded that video, I've gotten another member. Welcome, new member, Jeff Lindsay. Now, Jeff Lindsay, right. I don't know if it's the Dr. Jeff Lindsay who has become a member for my channel. If it is, oh my god, thank you so much for showing up, Jeff Lindsay. If it isn't the Dr. Jeff Lindsay, and it's just Jeff Lindsay, then welcome, Jeff. I'm sorry that I mistook you for someone else, but I still value you. Now, Jeff here has joined on a different level from everyone else. Now, anyone can become a member on my channel for about $1 or €1 or whatever your currency is. It's about one of those. Anyone can become a member, and that will be the lowest tier, which is the students tier. Now, Jeff here is the first person who's joined my channel as a member, not as a student, but as a professor. That is the $10 Australian tier. Now, any member of my channel gets a shout out at the end of the video, but Jeff, as a professor, also gets access to members only polls where they can put their input in for what videos I should make next. Here's the thing. Unfortunately, right now, I can't do any of those polls for, you know, what videos I should make next, because Jeff is the only person who is able to make those decisions. So it'd just be a poll with one vote, and at that point I might as well just ask Jeff what I should make next. So when I get more people on the professor tier, then those polls will exist. In the meantime, Jeff just gets a mega shout out at the end of the videos. Thank you very much for watching. I'm gonna go,